I do want to say this, that this wasn't the original plan. We were just meant to do a Q&A, and obviously, if anything had come up on NSARS, we'll have just taken it as with other questions. It's always nice to get a diversity of questions. But the more I thought about this, and the more I reflected, the more I looked at what was going on, and some of the pressures of people wanting to have not just what your stance, but how should we think about this? That has come up. And so as a result of that, I felt that, okay, it's best to make an address in some form. I do want to say also that in some ways I'm speaking in a personal capacity. I haven't taken, because of the time, not been able to take the other leaders through what I'm going to say. So I don't want to make this seem like it is a position of the church on this, all right? It's largely, it will reflect a lot of my views, and it's really views that have, not just on this current issue, but things that one has reflected over the years. So I'm going to speak on 4 things. I'm going to speak on 4 things as we think about this. I'm going to speak on the problem, I'm going to speak on the protest, I'm going to speak on the strategy, and I'm going to speak on Christianity, all right? Problems, protest, problems, protest, strategy, and Christianity, okay? So I'm going to try and be as quick as possible, but there's quite a lot to say. I should start with this. This needs to be addressed. It does need to be addressed, but I do want to ask for some patience with us. You see, especially as you think with protests build in us a sense of action. It builds in us a sense of action. And so we are looking for others to immediately react and also have a sense of action. But it's also important that even when things are very important and they seem or seem urgent and seem like things need to be done, that is important also for people to reflect on it, for people to think. And so the fact that some people haven't spoken out immediately doesn't mean they don't care or they are not passionate about this. But sometimes it is important to reflect and think deeply about what you say, because sometimes you, out of passion, just say things that you don't have a full understanding of what is going on. And so you end up saying things that you regret later. And so I want to ask, please, for patience with what I do want to say on this, even though I know that this needs to be addressed, and that's what we're talking about. Now, let me start by saying injustice grieves God's heart. I'm speaking to you not just as a Nigerian, not just as a concerned Nigerian, I'm speaking to you also as a Christian and also as a pastor. And I do want to say this: injustice grieves God's heart. There's so much of the Bible that speaks to injustice. In fact, when you see injustice, you see a lot of God's wrath. You know why? Because God is love. And when God sees the things that don't reflect love, i.e. injustice, God's wrath comes out of his love against that. There are injustices in Nigeria. Now, Yorubas will say, right? There are plenty of injustices in Nigeria. And I can't, like, if you just look all around, some of us are in an elite bubble. That is, all your friends have gone to university. All your friends have what you call white-collar jobs. Your children are going to good schools. You live in an area where all the people, your neighbors, are like that. So you can't see, you are closed up for that. And I do want to say, for a lot of us in City Church, that's where we are. I can say 95% of us in the City Church, we are in an elite bubble. But there are injustices for the majority of people in Nigeria, and we better wake up. Now, I'm not speaking on all of them. I just want to say, based on that, there is this injustice. There's a problem with police brutality. There is a problem with police brutality. Let us not mistake that. This isn't first and foremost saying anything about the police as a whole. It's just saying that there is a problem with police brutality, and particularly directed at certain groups of people. It comes a lot with profiling. It has been a pain for me personally, but I'm sure some of you, to read about some of the harrowing stories that have gone on. Some of it you just see with videos. There was a man that was, you could feel the man's pain, crying about his son, the hopes that he had for his son, and the way the son was mindlessly killed. There was a guy who posted a picture. This one was the one that moved me the most. A picture of his brother in a well, his decayed brother, who was just killed because he went to visit his friend at night, and they had a tussle with the police, and they just dumped his body there. I saw that picture, horrible, and he put a picture of his brother when he was full of life. A lot of the protests moved me. You could see people doing things, but the one that moved me the most, I won't lie, I don't know where it was. It was probably somewhere in Lagos Island. But you know what it was? It was old women together protesting. And you know what they were saying? They said, "Don't kill our children. Because if our children go, who is going to protect us?" In other words, young guys are not just scared of going out. Their parents are also scared of going out. For what reason? I shared my own personal example last week. I'm sorry, to also see that even in the protest, people are being killed. Fine, I don't think I've heard of anyone in Lagos, but I've heard of, Ogbomoso. I've heard in a few places, even they are protesting against police brutality, and then the police are being brutal against the people who are protesting. Do you see? There is a problem. I shared my personal example. I find out my wife corrected me that it wasn't SARS, but it was anti-kidnapping squad. And one day we were going to drop somebody here in church that came to visit us. My wife, myself, my sister-in-law, we were going to drop her. And not too far from my house, they quickly just stopped us. "Get down. Where are you going? Who are you? Blah, blah. Open your boots." And you could see their guns, as I said, the mouth of the gun was not pointing down, it was pointing up. And the way they spoke with the guns, there were about 3 of them. I was terrified inside because I'd heard of some of the stories, but you can't be sure. And the church, the booth, opened it, they won't even tell you why. So you're not sure. And then, who are those? Who are those in the car? Get down. Everybody get down. Why? And then until they said, "Who are you? Where are you?" I now said, "That's my wife. That's my sister-in-law. And here is a member of a congregation. I'm a pastor." And it was only then that they then said, "All right, you can go." Honestly, that got me scared of going out anytime around past 10 again. Some of the guys here that do the setup they do the setup on Saturday, a few weeks ago, Saturday evening, a few weeks ago, as they were returning, they were held by the same people because they had computers. There were young guys who had computers, and they held them for close to an hour. There is a problem with police brutality. We can't run away from that. But then that leads me to the second thing, the protests. And let me say 5 things about protests. First of all, the right to protest. We live in, whether you think it's a functioning democracy or not, at least it's a democracy. And part of why you have the right to protest, because any free democracy is built on certain freedoms. 2 of the fundamental freedoms are what? The freedom to assemble, the freedom of assembly, and the freedom of self-expression. And what protests are is, 1, they are built on the right of those freedoms. So that we have the right, people have the right to protest. Not the right to riot, but the right to protest. Because if we do live in a free society, we should be able to express ourselves and we should be able to gather together. Second thing, there is an importance. It's not just the right to it, but there is an importance of protests. Because protests, think about what you are saying, it is the voice of the unheard. It is, as you have built these systems are meant to work properly, but they are not working well for us. And usually the system works for the elite. And so the only tool of power that the protesters have is, the only tool of power that those who are oppressed have is to what? Is to protest when they come together so that you can hear them. Or else, if we don't do that, you will have a section of the society that eventually will turn against the other section, and the whole society will be broken. So we should thank God for protest, because if there is no protest, all you have is fomenting anger that eventually would lead to a revolution. You don't want that. So not only do we have the right to protest, we should value protests. But I do want to talk about the limitation of protests. Now, I've said those first two things, and I do want to clearly say, from a personal standpoint, I am for the protests. Not I don't mind the protests. I am for the protests. And I hope you are for the protests, for some of the things I've already said. I am for the protests. But I do also want to say, whilst protests, we have the right to protest, and there is the importance of protests, there are limitations of protests. And by limitations of protests, I'm now not saying they're not important. I'm saying this, that protests should not be an end in themselves. A protest should not be, it's not an end in itself. In fact, the protest, I would say, is the start of a particular thing. Why are people protesting? I'll tell you why they're protesting. Because not only are they sad, they're angry. Have you listened to some of the tweets, people talking? Have you seen, what you see there is anger. And what you find in the Bible with what we call lament is anger. It is a right thing to do that. I'm even speaking as a Christian. In fact, in Ephesians 4, the Bible says, be angry. But then it says, sin not. In other words, the kind of anger the Bible is asking for, and we should be seeing our protest, is controlled anger that is constructive. It is controlled, and it is what? Constructive. It is anger. But there's an anger that you can express that will not sin, because you have seen the situation and you say, this is not the way this thing should be, and I need to express that, but it is controlled. That is where it doesn't fall into sin. And because it is controlled, it can be constructive. In other words, if the protest is right, protests are not for the other kind of thing, which is the anger that is uncontrolled and inevitably is what? Destructive. Why are we protesting? We are not protesting so that, I hope, we are not protesting so that it's like, you know what? This system has not worked for us, so it hasn't worked for us, it's not going to work for you. Let everything just burn to the ground. That's destructive anger. At the end of the day, it doesn't pay anybody. But if our anger is controlled, if it is not sinful, then it is... The protests are saying this thing is wrong, and as Dami said, we are looking for a path to redemption that is constructive. The protests are meant to lead to something that is better, not worse for any part of the society, for both sides of the society. Are you with me? So when we protest, we are looking for something to construct a better and more just society. And therefore, that leads me to the effectiveness of protest. If you recognize the limitation of protest, but you recognize its right and its importance, then what should protest lead to? The effectiveness of protest comes when there is a strategy beyond it. There is a strategy that the protest sits within, and the protest is that works beyond the protest. That is when your protest is effective, because, fifth thing, there is a danger of protests. If you don't have any kind of strategy, if it's not constructive, you know what protests... Let me tell you part of the reason why I didn't tweet, I'm for it, but I didn't tweet hashtag end to rape, hashtag end SARS. Not because I'm not supporting, but I'm like, I'm not too old, but I am old enough to tell you that this is not the first protest I'm saying. I've seen a lot of protests. And I can tell you, very few of those protests eventually lead to anything. They don't, that is, they become an end themselves. All we do is that you can tell your children 30 years from now and grandchildren, you know, I was part of this march and this protest. Did it yield effective change? What are you protesting for? Your protest should eventually lead to an effective change. And I'm addressing people who have entered the protest without thinking beyond that. I'm not saying everyone. Thank God, and I'll get to that. Some people are thinking beyond that. But I'm just talking about the thing. For your protest to be effective, you have to be aware of the dangers. And some of the dangers I'm saying is that, one, it eventually amounts to nothing because you didn't have a strategy. Second is, many people are taking their eye off the ball. That is, within the protest, you can start to fragment within the protest. For instance, some people can be, I've heard, for instance, one of the big injustices that we have is that women have been harassed within the protest. So here we are protesting against police brutality, but some of the people that are protesting against police brutality should be people that we should speak to say, this is not the way you treat women. So within the protest, it can actually self-destruct. Because we start looking at one another. Here's another thing that we do. This one is particularly grievous. Please. The fact that you are passionate about a particular thing does not mean, and you are passionate about a particular thing, and because you are passionate about that thing, you decide to do a certain thing, like protest. Don't then look at somebody who is not protesting and saying they are not also as passionate about it. We may have the same goal, but we may have different ways of trying to achieve it. One of the things that I saw that as was going on, and sorry, I'll just call a name, and maybe I'm speaking not for City Church, I'm speaking for Femi. I thought the whole Burna Boy thing was a bit ridiculous. People calling out Burna Boy, and I'm like, do you see what you are doing? You have all these celebrities that are here for this thing. You are concerned about the person that is not here. You are taking your eye off the ball. What do you want? Take the people that are with you. Look at the people that are with you. Why are you concentrating on somebody that is not with you? And I'm saying, well, in your songs, that means that your songs, you did it for money and all of that. This is how the movement starts to fragment. And I can tell you, the people that are enemies of the thing that you want to achieve, they love it when that happens. This is the distraction that brings fragmentation. You take your eye off the ball rather than set yourself on the goal. You don't know what some people are doing. The fact that they are silent doesn't mean that they are not doing things. You go ahead and do what you want to do. Third thing about this is, let me say one more thing about this. Be very careful, because that means someone really spoke to this thing. We immediately, being part of the protest, we eventually quickly see the us and them mentality. And therefore, we start to say, we are the righteous ones. Why are you not joining us? There's a lot of virtue signaling. Why are you not joining us? If you're not joining us, that means you are for them. Who told you that? Listen, be careful. The fact that you are very passionate about something and other people are not doesn't mean that they are terrible people. I can ask, because this thing is really fueled by a lot of young people. Rightly so. Remember, I said I am for this. But this thing hits a particular generation, young people. And that's why they're out there. And so they're shouting, you other old people, why aren't you with us? Why aren't you with us? You, our parents, you have failed us. When last did any young person say, we are going to start a campaign for pay pensions now? Do you know what that means? Exactly. Most of us have not heard about it. Many people in civil service, I know a particular relative has come out of civil service 2.5 years now, has not been paid 1 month of her pension. Is that an injustice? Now, if the person then says, you people too don't care about us, about our own pension, why aren't you doing that? Do you see, like, we can do the us versus them mentality. I'm not saying now, because you didn't match for end pay pensions now, you should not match for end SARS. I'm saying the fact that you're doing NSARS and somebody is not doing NSARS, that doesn't mean they are horrible people. Focus on what you are doing. Stop picking enemies up and about. And also, I should say this, define your enemies very, very, very well. I preached a message about this, sin is systemic. We talked about sexism. And I said one of these things, the oppressed class, at the end of the day, you still need the people in power. You still need the people in power if you want to effect change. So yes, call them to account, but be careful not to turn them to your enemies, because then it is not constructive. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying be quiet. I'm not saying don't hold them to account. I'm not saying if they have made promises before and they didn't keep them, that you shouldn't hold them to account. I'll get to what the strategy is. But be careful how you define your enemies. Why are you protesting? It has limitations. We want protests to be effective. Which then takes me to the strategy. As I've said, there are diversities of strategy. I want to lay out something that I've seen in history, but there are diversities of strategy. Please, the fact that you have adopted a particular one and others are not adopting it, don't start making enemies on them. Just follow your lane. But you have to have a strategy that protest sits within and that eventually affects change. And sometimes you have to be in here in the long term. Let me tell you the story. Do you know the biggest movement, the biggest protest movement, but I would say justice movement that was, well, started in the 60s, but really was the most dominant between the mid-70s to the late 80s. When I grew up, this is all I knew. Do you know what that movement was? Who knows? Global movement. Well, we think that with the hashtag, this one that somebody has tweeted, hashtag, I think some American guys tweeted this thing that, we've gone global. This one lasted, I said, 30 years. But it was most intense from the late 70s to the end of the 80s. You know what it was? The Anti-Apartheid Movement. The Anti-Apartheid Movement. The Anti-Apartheid Movement, I just want to tell you a little bit about what happened in Britain. Because, look, there are few more entrenched systems than apartheid in South Africa. It was hundreds of years. How do you bring it down? It's not one protest over a week. It was protest that then had a particular strategy over a period of time that brought it down. Let me tell you a few of the things that happened. They gathered, the first group of people were exiled South Africans in England that gathered together in 1959. The thing ended in 1990. How many years is that? 31 years. When those people gathered, here are some of the things that happened. They gathered together. First, a group of exiles. They brought together trade unions. They got together students. In other words, they were building a coalition, a diverse coalition. They started rallies. The first pressure they put was on the British government to ask. They had already crafted together a policy of how we bring this thing down. They came with a policy of economic sanctions against South Africa. It took a while before people caught up with that. Eventually, the Commonwealth was just being formed because the British Empire was no longer what it was again. And these people put enough pressure in such a way that eventually South Africa had to leave the Commonwealth. Fast forward after that, what eventually did they do as this thing was growing? Again, they were building strategy. They pushed it to the UN until the UN had passed a resolution for trade boycott. So there was first economic sanctions they were thinking about. Then the UN pushed for trade boycott against South Africa. You know what's happening? It's hurting them in their pockets. Eventually, they love sport. They went to the Olympics. They pushed the Olympic Committee. They stopped them from participating in 1968 Olympics and going further. And if you are in South Africa, if you've ever lived in South Africa or been there, you will know that the one sport that is their religion, you know what it is, of the white South Africans, it's not Olympics. You know what it is? Rugby. So as long as they had rugby, they were fine. Until they pressured the World Rugby Union to stop South Africa from participating in, or actually they stopped people from going to play in South Africa. That hurt them. Can you see what I'm saying? And protests continued. They were building momentum. Then the economic sanction campaign started all around. Then there were sanctions. They started to say, okay, if you are running for office in Britain, what is your view on the economic sanctions in South Africa? They had already built a ground game so that if you did not support it, chances are you will not win your election. Then eventually professors started saying they will not work with academic institutions in South Africa. If you were in the 80s, you will see that all the biggest concerts were concerts that were raising money for the struggle. Then we had all the free Mandela stuff. Do you remember that, Moses? Huh? Even Majek Vashek said, Margaret Thatcher, George Bush, free Mandela. Until eventually the thing came down. What am I saying? Protest But the effectiveness of a protest comes with a strategy. What is that strategy? This is just a strategy I can just put for you guys. You know, I'm a preacher, so I have to, let me say 5 things. Protestation, coordination, negotiation, consolidation, institution. Protestation, what we see now, people are protesting. It's a good thing. You know why? It's the only power that the oppressed have. It brings awareness. Continue the protest, please. It is important. It brings awareness. It gets the voice of those in power. But as you are protesting, there needs to be coordination. There needs to be a group of people. Some people are saying it's decentralized. That's the wonderful thing about it. Yes, it's a wonderful thing when it's decentralized. But please, in all those decentralized units, have leaders that know what they are doing, that are coordinating people, that are able to fuel people, that are able to get the people that will bring water to provide for the protesters, that will tell the protesters don't become violent, that know what they are doing and are trying to effect the strategy. Then negotiation. When they have now said, oh yeah, come to the table, what are you going to tell them you want? Not just protest. Okay, what do you want? Now, it is in this place that you should have worked out what you wanted, because remember, when you said reform, they didn't listen. They put reform, nothing happened. We don't want announcements again, because you announced before and nothing happened. So it means that announcements are not effective. They're not listening to you. So at that point, we have to the people that are doing that have to come up with negotiation demands that can keep them accountable. And then as you do that, consolidation. Don't allow the fire to die because you have presented your negotiation. Continue to build a base. Lecture. Do all the different things. Explain why this thing is important. Keep the message going on in corridors of power. And then finally, and this is probably the most important thing, listen to me. And if we do this, this is not just how we bring change in the police, how we bring change in Nigeria. And people, especially if you're part of movements, we don't like hearing this word, institution. Why do things lose their fire? Because at the end of the day, as Jesus said, somebody said, I just married a wife. You see, I've seen a lot of people putting tweets about how, they are so happy they joined the protest today. Today? You think it's today that's going to bring down a systemic issue? Institutions are there to keep the dynamics of the movement going. You have to set up think tanks. You have to set up people, lobby organizations. And that's where, if you're a part of the movement, when you see these things, you have to put your money down. There has to be fundraising. If you don't listen, I'm not saying this is the only kind of strategy, but I'm saying if you don't have this, we will protest. All we will do is that eventually the FSARS protest will feature on Wikipedia. And we'll read about it 10 years later. And what happened? Nothing. The Anti-Apartheid Movement spawned so many institutions. That's why it kept going on. It is there we can start telling people in Nigeria, the next election in 2023, we'll have already built a ground game. We're saying this is what you need. By the time you know that, they know that this thing is going to be attached to votes, because people have been doing grassroots education for years. Then a politician needs to listen and effect change, or else they'll be voted out or they won't even be voted in. If we don't have these things, we are just playing games. But I do want to say this too, guys. I know it has become a dirty word. And in fact, if you use this word, they can cancel you. FSARS, yes. But our police need reform. Yeah, I said the word reform. Because ultimately, I don't want to live in a society where we don't have a police force. We need the police. And I'm not saying people are saying don't end that, but there are some radical elements. So even if we end SARS, as many people have pointed out, if you end SARS, you ended a program within the police. What about the people that are within there? They'll be plugged into other places and they'll continue their brutality. The brutality my wife, the harassment my wife and I faced was from was from the kidnapping squad. When those ones have seen how the money the SARS people have gained, they too will affect it. The police, I know it has been bad. But ultimately, the structure within a democracy of having a police force, they are not meant to be your enemies. They need reform. And can I say this? They need reform because The police themselves are victims. SARS guys that are wicked are victims. Did you hear what Dami said today in the sermon? A lot of the people that were hurting people were people that have been hurt themselves. Listen to me. Corruption has radicalized them. I am not saying they should not be held responsible. There was a video I saw where they pulled the guy they pulled the guy and they said, "Oh yeah, bring a phone. How much is this phone?" The guy said, young guy, he said, so imagine the young guy is like 22, 23. The man that is asking him that is probably in his late 30s or early 40s. He said, how much is the phone? He said 250,000. Do you know what the police officer said? I have been in this force for 13 years. I have never even dreamt of buying a phone for 250,000. What is there? It is envy, it is pain, it is a failure of a system. They too have been radicalized by corruption. When you have a police force that you are saying should risk their lives, but at the same time you don't provide welfare for them, you don't provide a living wage for them, and you look down upon them, and you say that they are the enemy, why do you think they will want to protect you? This is in no way condoning what they do. I am saying that we too are part of the problem by looking away. When last did we say hashtag save the police? Only when it hits us, then we go out. And I'm saying if you want the change here, it is not just campaigning for us. We have to campaign for them. When the police budget has been signed by the maybe they sign 5 billion naira. Before it gets to them, it is 3 billion that will come. Before 3 billion, that's at the top. By the time they're effecting it to all the agencies, we were 1.5 billion. We started with 5 billion, we ended with 1.5 billion. And then DPO collects his own, regional, whatever. And so the guy that is the recruit is giving, his uniform is not well, he's been wearing the same uniform for how many years? 10 years. His guns are not working well. All of the different things. And he has 3 children not going to school. The cycle of poverty continues. Whereas the people up there, their children keep going abroad. And you keep looking down on them. I have not in 13 years seen a phone of 250,000 and you, this small boy that is looking down on me. That's the problem. They too have been radicalized because they are victims. And that's why the police needs reform. They are not our enemies. They have been made our enemies because they are victims of corruption as well. So as we think about our strategy, as we want to end this thing, we have to also think about that. Finally, I want to talk about Christianity. You see, when you have protests like this, wide protests, one of the good things is that they are a coalition. They're a coalition of people, like this one will be a coalition of Christians, Muslims, people of no faith, and all of those things. At least some of the things I've seen, people are not. But I want to tell you this, if you are a Christian, partake in it, but partake in it as a Christian. There is no such thing as I've left my religion outside. Nobody should go into a coalition. What is a true coalition? It is when people who are of different backgrounds and different beliefs come with their beliefs but saying we all have a common goal. Don't leave your Christianity outside. And by not leaving your Christianity outside, I'm saying this. First of all, don't forget that the line of between good and evil runs through the heart of every man, including you. As Dami said, we also have feet of clay. Maybe you have not brutalized somebody with a gun because you don't have access to it, but have you brutalized somebody with your words? In other words, when you protest, protest with humility. Don't protest from a place of self-righteousness. God hates it. Remember, you are a Christian. We have been unjust to some of our employees, we've been unjust to our children, we've been unjust to our spouses. So please, go out and protest with godliness and humility. When others are insulting people, don't insult. When others are harassing ladies, stop them from doing so. When others are saying it in such a way that we just want to bring chaos, be constructive. Show godliness. But we're also Christians because when people see no more hope, it's like everything in Nigeria is crumbling. That's why a lot of people are leaving. Christians say our story ends in hope. You know, one of the wonderful things about protests and laments, when done well, it is a voice of saying, it's a cry of, I hate how things are, but it is also profoundly a cry of, things can be better. It is people without hope that don't protest. There are some people without spirit, like, what's the use? It's not going to change. So if you're a protester, you are protesting because of hope. Don't lose hope. Dear Christian, things may seem very bad, but I want you to go out, protest in hope. And if you are one of those leaders also that is doing more than the protesting, you are coordinating, you are negotiating and coming up with it, please do it with hope, because we believe in a story that ends in hope. Some people are going to say this to you. You will look stupid, but don't care. Some people say, it's not time for prayer, it's time for action. Prayer is action, guys. Some of the things we are facing are no protest can solve. But there is a God that we can call upon that will. So before you go out to protest, pray. As you are protesting, pray. After you finish the protest, what? Pray. The Muslim behind you may not be able to do it. The person with no faith, but do that as well. Don't let anybody tell you that it is inaction. No, it is profound. It is the most important action. And then finally, this world is not our final hope. And so even when we don't see things that we desire in imperfection, it is because we are looking forward ultimately to a kingdom where there is full justice and full equity. That is partly why we work for justice and equity now. But don't put all your hopes in this world, because even if we bring down the police, FSARS, it doesn't end there. In Jesus, we find the kingdom of righteousness and justice that we are all looking forward to. Thank you for your patience, and thank you for listening. God bless you.